So my name is Josh Schwartz. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. Before I begin, I want to give a few quick words of thanks. First of all, to the organizers of O&A, both for having me and for putting on such a fantastic conference each and every year. You know, coming to O&A is always one of the highlights of the year for me personally, and it's such an honor to be with you here on stage today. Second of all, I want to thank all of you for the incredible work that you do and for taking some time out of your day and out of your conference to join me here today. You know, now more than ever, the work of journalism is so critical to the functioning of our society, and the best part of my job is getting to help you do yours, so thank you so much. I look forward to your questions, to your feedback, and to working with you over the years to come. And finally, I want to give a few quick words of thanks to a few folks on my team who worked tirelessly getting this project together. It's really a group effort to do these sorts of presentations. So quick call outs to Sue Hang and Chris Bro from our data science team, without whom many of the data points that you'll see wouldn't be here, and to Nicolette Ognate and Terry Walter from our marketing team who helped put together the content of the presentation. So to start things off, I want to give a very quick background to myself and to Chartbeat. For anybody who's not familiar, Chartbeat is a leading analytics company that is entirely focused on the needs of media companies throughout the world. We make products that help each story reach its best audience and help people build and grow a loyal audience over time. In my role, I oversee product development, engineering, and data science within the company. So with my product and engineering hats on, I'm responsible for fundamental research that goes into doing what we do. So that means machine learning, natural language processing, computer science research that helps us build future generations of products, as well as what we call media research. We basically take the data set across all of our customers, more than 50 billion page views a month, and kind of flip it inside out and try to understand trends in how people are reading and what they're reading. And that brings me to talks like this one today. So this is my third year presenting at O&A. And each year when we put together the talk, what we try to do is look at, really what are the key questions that people are asking in audience development, and how can we use our data set to help answer those? So last year, for example, as so many publishers began exploring subscription models, we tried to look at the process of taking people from incidental visitors to loyalists and to subscribers over time. This year, though, I want to turn our attention to the mobile world. Now, internet consumption writ large has long since shifted to being majority mobile, but news consumption has somewhat lagged that trend. I think because so many people spend a portion of their workday while at work and on a desktop reading the news, we've actually seen news consumption broadly still say majority and then plurality desktop until almost the present day. But very recently, that's begun to change. And that's what we're showing in this first plot. So in this graph, we're seeing across the last 20 months, so the beginning of 2017 through the present day, the share of traffic from desktop in blue, mobile in orange, and tablet at the bottom in teal. And basically what we see are two distinct trends here. First of all, we've seen that desktop traffic has gone fairly dramatically and steadily down over the last 20 months. It's down more than 20% in that time period. And as you can see, it's a fairly steady decrease. The one thing that I'll note that helps us kind of understand this kind of workday phenomenon is in the middle you see this large dip in desktop where it drops really quite a lot. And that's the week from Christmas to New Year's, right? So that just shows you when people are away from work how much desktop traffic falls. On the mobile side, we've seen basically the opposite trend. So mobile traffic is up more than 20% in the last 20 months. And again, it's slowly and steadily increased. It's not like there's one motivating event that raises that volume of traffic. And I'll note that on the mobile side, we don't see much of a kind of concurrent dip on the holiday side. It really is a desktop-only phenomenon. So if we step back from this, what we've seen is a real reversal in traffic, right? 2 years ago, desktop had a fairly strong majority, and today, mobile has a plurality of traffic, and that number is continuing to grow pretty quickly. And that presents a number of challenges, right? A mobile reader is quite different from a desktop reader, right? A mobile reader accesses our sites often from different channels. They engage with stories and pages quite differently. And they have different habits of loyalty and properties of coming back over time. But the challenges that we face are still the same, right? We still want each story we write to reach its best audience. We want people to actually read the stories once they land on them. And we want people to come back over time and potentially become loyalists, become habitual users, become subscribers. So understanding how mobile readers differ from desktop readers is key if we're going to succeed in a world where mobile is growing into a strong majority of traffic to news sites across the world. So that's going to be the focus of this talk. We'll break things into essentially two segments. So we'll start by talking about some very notable changes that we've seen on the platform side in terms of referral sources and discovery and how people are getting to news sites today on mobile. And then we'll move into engagement, and we'll talk about how people are reading differently on mobile devices versus desktop, and how people are building habits of loyalty differently. And we'll talk through what that looks like. So with that, I'll jump in and start by talking about some changes in referral traffic. And we'll start at the very top of the market with a substantial reversal in trends that we've seen in the last couple of years in the very largest sources of news traffic. So the first thing that I'll highlight, which won't be a surprise to anyone in this room, is that we've seen a fairly drastic decline in the volume of Facebook traffic to publishers in the last 2 years. More than a 40% decline since January 2017. If we look at this graph, we basically see two periods of major decline. The first one is in October of last year. Over the space of just a few weeks, we see a fairly substantial and steep decline. I think that one makes sense. Just a couple of months later, Facebook announced that they were starting to deprioritize publisher posts in the newsfeed. So the timing of that decline and followed fairly shortly by an announcement kind of makes sense. But more recently, we've seen another interesting decline. So since May, traffic is down another 20%. And I think the interesting thing for me is that there's no obvious cause of that. We haven't seen a Facebook announcement on that front that would explain this. So I think there basically are three hypotheses that we have to think about. One is a Facebook change that's unannounced. Obviously, things change all the time on that front. Another is a change in how publishers are approaching Facebook and whether they're publishing less often or investing less. And the third is a change in consumer sentiment. Now, understanding that is difficult to get at, but it's something that we're very closely watching over time. Now, turning our eyes to Google and specifically Google Search, what we've seen is essentially the opposite trend on the Google side. So Google traffic has more than doubled in the last 20 months. At the beginning of 2017, we were seeing about 650 million visits a week across our network driven by Google Search. And today we're seeing more than 1.3 billion visits a week, so more than a 2x increase on mobile from Google Search. And again, kind of looking at this graph in terms of broad phases, we can see two big periods of increase here as well. The first is last summer, mid-August, we see a very steep increase over the space of just a couple weeks, more than a 30, often a 40% increase in mobile Google Search traffic in just a few weeks. Very clearly a product change or a set of product changes on Google's end. And then more recently, since essentially the beginning of 2018, we've seen another period of a fairly steep rise in traffic. Almost every time we pull this graph, as we were getting ready for this presentation, when we made the graph week after week, the numbers just kind of continued to go up, and they seem to be continuing to rise over time. So a couple of points I'd like to make about these two lines in tandem. The first thing, something you might be wondering, is Google's rise is actually substantially larger than Facebook's decline. So on net, if we look at the sum of traffic between these two, publishers are getting more traffic from these two platforms than they were 20 months ago. The other thing that I'll note is that these lines, although they go in opposite directions, are not correlated in the sense that, somebody might wonder, is this users switching from Google to Facebook or from Facebook to Google? And we don't see evidence of that in these graphs. So the Google increase in August, we don't see an immediate decline in Facebook. The Facebook decline in May isn't represented on the Google side by a large increase. So it doesn't look like this is as simple as users immediately switching from one platform to another. Now, when it comes to the largest sources of traffic, typically there's kind of a triumvirate, right? So we have Google Search, Facebook, and direct visitors. But usually when we think about a direct visitor, we think about them as a primarily desktop phenomenon. But interestingly, that too has begun to change in recent days. So now I'm adding to the graph direct visits to media sites over the last 20 months. What we see is that direct traffic has grown more than 30% from about 800 million visits a week up to 1.1 billion today. So 30% increase in that period. In this graph, what we see is that there's no clear phase change, right? This is just a steady increase over time. Now, for any data wonks in the room, I'll note one subtlety of this data is that when we talk about direct traffic here, we're talking about kind of true direct traffic. So this is people showing up without a refer and on specifically a home page or a front page, not people showing up as what's often called dark social, where they end up as on an article page. Those are not counted as direct here. So this is more or less true direct. This is a rise in unreferred home page and section front traffic. That's pretty fascinating. So now let's step back and talk about all three of these trends in tandem. If I'd been giving this talk 2 years ago, I probably would have said something like this. Mobile traffic and social traffic are almost one and the same, right? The majority of mobile traffic is social, the majority of social traffic is mobile, and when you're a publisher trying to reach people on a mobile device, really social is the channel that you go to. Now, we couldn't be further from that sort of position. Today, Google is by far the dominant platform on mobile devices, as it's been on desktop for many, many years. Direct is also a meaningful way that people are getting to news sites and news apps. And Facebook, although still quite substantial, is a fairly distant third. The other thing that I'll note is that all three of these trends show signs of continuing, right? As I mentioned earlier, the Google line is going up week over week. The direct line continues to go up week over week. And the Facebook line is continuing to decline. So these are things that we should expect to play out. And if we're back here in a year, we should expect to see these lines having diverged further as we move forward into the future. So I think the question that we have to begin to ask then is really, what does a declining Facebook mean for publishers? If Facebook is not going to be the source of audience growth, particularly on mobile that it once was, what does that mean for how people are getting the news, particularly on mobile? Now, that's mostly outside of my domain. It's not the domain of analytics, right? It's almost a philosophy question or a social science question, right? How are consumers going to change? Difficult to answer. But every now and then, we can sort of view that in a really micro way when there are specific things that happen on the web. So I'll highlight an example of that, which luckily enough happened just as we were beginning to prepare this talk. So on August 3rd, Facebook went down for 45 minutes. We saw essentially no traffic globally from Facebook. It dropped off almost entirely and really only existed because a few people had Facebook pages open at the time when it went down. But no new Facebook pages were rendering in app on the web across the world. And so the question you can ask yourself is, in a world where Facebook was not a way that people could get their news, what happened? Did people just close their phones and sort of go back to their days? Or did people switch platforms and actually continue to engage, but engage differently? So that's what we'll look at on the next slide. And something fascinating happened. What we saw is that overall traffic, although Facebook was out of the picture, actually went up. It grew by a small amount, but 2.3% across the world. That's a fascinating thing to see. Overall traffic go up with one of the largest sources of traffic across the world not in the picture. That was driven by basically two things. The first was that we saw a very substantial increase in some different refers. So we saw an 11% increase in direct traffic. So 11% more people accessed publisher sites directly during that window. That increase itself was driven by a huge increase in app opens. So we saw a 22% increase in app opens, right? So somebody had the Facebook app open, it didn't work, and so they switched over and used a publisher app instead. That's fascinating to see, and in some ways really heartening, right? It shows that consumers really actually wanted to get the news. They didn't just want to whittle away a few minutes. They really wanted the news, and when one news source didn't work for them, they switched to another app. We also saw a meaningful increase in search traffic, a little bit smaller, but still quite significant, an 8% increase in Google search traffic in that window. Now, so we saw consumers shift how they got to sites, but another interesting thing happened in that window as well, which is that because so many more visitors were coming via direct or via app opens than typically occurred, those visitors tend to have higher quality visits, right? If somebody comes in directly, they tend to stick around on the site for a little bit longer. If somebody opens an app, they tend to stick around. So we actually saw visit depth, page views per visit, go up during this window at well, another 5%. So we saw people switch channels and people engage more deeply, which is fascinating to see. Now, of course, this is a simple experiment, right? In this world, all that we can see is what happens in the moment when one channel goes away. And I'll note that the longer-term effects of these change in platforms, I think, is something that's much more complex and something that we'll have to see play out over time. But this is a really interesting window into how users might shift in a world where there's less Facebook traffic moving around. So far, we've been focused on the 3 largest sources of traffic. Next, I'm going to look at kind of the next largest tier of traffic. So if we take basically refers 4 through 10, so the top 10 minus Google, Facebook, and Direct. And all of these are about 1/10 the size of those big 3. So significantly smaller, but still material. We've seen some really interesting changes on this front as well. The first change, which I think many people will have heard of, actually, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing that I'll note is that when it comes to kind of the traditional refers, the ones who have been around for quite a while, so things like Twitter and Yahoo and Outbrain, that traffic has been more or less constant over the last 20 months. So we've seen a small decline in Twitter traffic, a kind of decline followed by resurgence of Yahoo traffic, and so on. But by and large, these lines are pretty much constant. On the other hand, with some other refers, we've seen some pretty dynamic changes. So the first one to highlight is Flipboard. This has gotten a lot of press, so it's probably familiar to this group. We've seen more than a 2x increase in Flipboard in the last couple of years. And Flipboard is now sending dramatically more traffic than things like Yahoo and Outbrain are today. So it's grown quite a large bit. Now, I'll note a couple of things about Flipboard. One thing that's interesting to me is that Flipboard has a kind of unique audience acquisition strategy because it's installed by default on a set of Samsung devices as Flipboard Briefing. So that's one way that people are getting access to Flipboard. Another thing that I'll note that's kind of an in-the-weeds data point, but an important one to make, is that Flipboard has actually made an important set of product changes on their end that at least are one of the major drivers of this change. So a couple of years ago, if you were a user in Flipboard and you clicked a link, you frequently ended up still inside of the Flipboard app. It was a little bit more of a walled garden. And sometimes you landed on a publisher page, but for the most part, you were reading a publisher page within the app. Today, if you click a link in Flipboard, you end up on a publisher website. So it's much more referral traffic than a walled garden. And so that naturally has increased the volume of referral traffic that people are seeing because they've consciously chosen to send that traffic. But again, just to note here, Flipboard is an aggregator and is installed by default as its kind of way of acquiring users. Next, in terms of increase, we have Google News. As folks may be familiar with, Google News relaunched a couple of months ago in May of this year, and there was a big change. The whole Google ecosystem of news-related apps kind of changed. And in particular, Google Play Newsstand was deprecated, and Google News became kind of the main Google News app. And Google Play Newsstand, it sent a material amount of traffic on mobile. So we would have expected to see, now that all of that traffic was concentrated in this one app, we would have expected to see traffic go up. But actually, Google News traffic has risen more than we would have expected. We're up about 20% from where we would have been when traffic was split between those two apps. So something interesting has happened here. And I'll note with Google News that like Flipboard, Google News, first of all, is an aggregator, not an original content producer. And second of all, it's installed by default on a set of phones, right? It's installed by default on a number of Android devices. So it also has this kind of property. The third refer I'll highlight is a funny refer that we call Google Chrome Suggestions. So if you haven't heard of Chrome Suggestions, if you pull out your phone right now and you open Chrome, whether it's an iPhone or an Android, and you open Chrome and you pop open a new tab, you'll see something that you may not even have noticed existed, which is that tab will be filled with a list of articles called Articles for You. If you click on those links, you've been referred by Google Chrome Suggestions. So that's what that refer is. And because that list shows up in every new tab in the most used browser on the most used operating system on mobile, it's actually become an extraordinarily large traffic driver. It's sending more traffic, or as much traffic, depending on the week, to publishers than Twitter is, which is pretty remarkable, right? How much effort from folks in this room goes toward thinking about how to get stories to succeed on Twitter, relative to how much effort have folks put into thinking about story performance on Google Chrome suggestions, right? Probably not a single person here has thought about that. But if it's going to be a meaningful way, potentially the third largest or fourth largest way that people get access to our stories, then it's worth thinking about how to make stories do well on this platform. And I think it's particularly important to think about because what we've seen in our data is that Google Chrome Suggestions performance doesn't really have any relationship with other Google performance. So the top stories on Chrome Suggestions don't look like the top stories on Google Search or on Google News. So it seems to be quite a different beast. And again, I'll note that Chrome Suggestions, it's not installed by default on the device, but again, it has this property where it's an aggregator and it shows up in this case, by default, in the browser. So it also has this property. And so we've seen 3 examples of the fastest growing referrers all having this property. They're all kind of news-focused. They're all aggregators. And they all have this kind of built-in way of acquiring users. And we haven't even talked about probably the most interesting of those, which is Apple News, which of course is also built into the device, also news-focused, and also is an aggregator. So what we've seen is overall, just this new class of referrers seems to be emerging that really in some ways harkens back to the portals of the days of yore on desktop, right? This is a class of aggregators that kind of just show up when people open the device, and that's a really interesting development. This rise of the mobile portal is something that we hadn't seen prior to today. So to wrap up this section on referrals, I want to touch on a few key points. I think the first question is, with this huge decline in Facebook and a modest decline in Twitter, I think we have to ask whether we're beginning to be in a post-social world, at least when it comes to referred traffic. And if so, if social is not going to be the main mechanism by which we reach users on mobile, then what comes next? How do we still get our stories out to a large and robust audience? We've seen a few answers, right? So we've seen that the Google ecosystem is by far the dominant platform on mobile. On the first graph, we were only looking at Google Search, but 2 of the 3 other referrers that we talked about are also owned by Google, right? So Google really has cemented itself as by far the dominant platform. We also see that direct traffic is incredibly important on mobile, and it's continuing to grow as an important traffic source. And finally, we identified this kind of unique and growing set of these mobile portals that are continuing to grow over time and will be really interesting to watch. So we've talked a lot about referral sources, but of course our goal isn't just to get people in. We want people to actually engage with our stories when they land on them. And so understanding the difference between engagement on mobile and desktop is also critically important. And so we'll start by talking about homepage engagement, right? We've seen direct traffic rise significantly on mobile, and that means thinking about engagement on the mobile homepage or on the front page of a mobile app is actually increasingly important in the modern world. We can think about 3 basic metrics if we're gonna try to quantify engagement with a homepage. We can think about scroll depth. So how far down the page did people read? Did somebody just see the top few stories on the homepage? Did people scroll all the way down to see the whole thing? We can think about engaged time. So did people actually read content on the homepage, or did they kind of quickly scroll through but not actually really stop to read our headlines or read other stories on the page? And third of all, we can think about raw click-through rate. Did people, after opening the homepage, actually click on something, or did they just kind of open the page, browse it and leave, or leave it idle in a backgrounded tab? So we'll talk about the differences between mobile and desktop readers along each of these 3 dimensions. I'll start with scroll depth. So here we're looking at scroll depth between desktop on the left and mobile on the right. And these are basically heat maps. So they're showing us where user behavior was concentrated on the page on mobile versus desktop. What we see is that mobile visitors are much more concentrated at the top of the page versus desktop readers who are much more spread out in terms of where they engage. In fact, mobile visitors see an average of 25% of a home page versus desktop visitors who see an average 34%. So pretty substantial difference in terms of how far down the page people scroll. And that means there's a pretty stark difference in terms of which stories people actually even come across if they're visiting a homepage as their way of landing on a site. So that's a little bit about scroll. And in some ways paints a negative picture about a mobile visitor, right? They're less engaged, they spend more time at the top. But by the other two metrics, we reach kind of the opposite conclusion. So in terms of engaged time, what we actually see is mobile visitors are significantly more engaged, 40% more engaged than desktop visitors. They spend an average 22 seconds of engaged time versus 16 seconds of engaged time on desktop. Now I'll note those numbers feel pretty small, but these are home pages after all, right? These are pages that people open, browse, and quickly choose to click something. So they're not pages that we see a large amount of engaged time on typically. In terms of click-through rate, we see a similar conclusion. So mobile click-through rate, we see an average 67% of people click a story on a homepage after visiting it, whereas it's only 56% on desktop. So again, mobile engagement in terms of click-through rate seems to be substantially higher. So now if we step back and think about all three of these metrics together, the picture that we get is a mobile visitor who spends most of their time at the top of the page, but actually seems to really read the stories that are there, versus a desktop visitor who spends much less time, and that time is much more spread out across the page. A mobile visitor is also more likely to actually click the story that they see, so they're more engaged by both the time and click-through metrics. And so, I think one thing that's really clear in this data is that simply taking a desktop homepage, making it responsive, and calling it a day is probably not likely a strategy for creating a sort of optimally engaged mobile homepage or app front page. You really have to think about the kind of mode of operating of that reader as being quite different depending on device. So that's a little bit about homepages. Now let's turn our eye toward article pages. And with articles, there's so much more complexity in how people interact with an article. So we actually turned to an academic partnership. Over the last couple of years, one academic that we've partnered with has been Nir Greenberg, who's a professor at Northeastern University. And with Nir, what we did is try to understand different types of reading behavior. For anybody who's curious, there's a link to the paper below, and you can read the paper in its full detail there. So in this paper, what we did is we took a set of about 7 million visits to article pages across a set of sites, and we tried to quantify them in terms of basically every metric of engagement we could come up with. How far down the page did they scroll? How long in terms of just normal wall clock time was a person on the page? How deeply did they engage with the page in terms of engaged time? What was their scroll velocity? How long was the article, and how did that compare to their time on page, and so on? So basically every metric we could come up with. And what we tried to do is group those readers into distinct segments and identify different kind of types of reading on the page. And so I'll walk through the 6 distinct segments that Nir identified in his research. The first he termed bounce backs. So a bounce back is somebody who just opens the page and immediately bounces back. People who spend fewer than 10 seconds with the page open at all. Very, very little engagement. The second, also kind of a low quality way of engaging with a page, but pretty differently, is idle visitors. So these people have high raw time on page. The page may be open for 10, 15 minutes, but very low actual engaged time. You can think about the classic thing that generates an idle visit being opening a page in a new tab and never actually taking the time to go back and read it. That's a classic idle visit. Third, we have shallow visitors. So these are people who show a little bit of engagement, a few signs of life on the page, but very minimal, right? People who spend 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds of engaged time on the page. So a little bit, but not much. Fourth, and starting to get into the slightly higher quality modes of engagement, we have scanners. So these are people who actually scroll pretty thoroughly. They make it down through a substantial fraction of the page, but they scroll so quickly that they couldn't reasonably be reading it. People who scroll 1,000 words a minute, 1,500 words a minute, which is far above the kind of average 200 words a minute that a typical person actually reads at. So they're seeing the whole article, but not really engaging. Then finally, we have readers and long readers. So readers are people who read, people who actually engage with our stories. They're people who tend to scroll through a pretty meaningful fraction of the article and tend to spend 1 minute to 2 minutes of engaged time on the story. So real meaningful readership on the page. And finally, long readers essentially exhibit the same properties, but much deeper. So these are people who scroll to the end of the article, often into the comments, spend 3, 4, 5 minutes engaging, and so on. So just much deeper engagement, and sometimes on much longer pieces of content. So with those segments identified, the next thing that we can do is kind of look across our data set and try to understand how those readers break down across pages. And in particular, look for differences in mobile and desktop reading behavior. So we'll start by looking at the 3 kind of low-quality types of engagement. So bounce backs, people who leave immediately, idle visitors who leave kind of tabs open and things like that, and shallow visitors who show minimal engagement on the page. And with these 3, we actually see pretty stark differences between mobile and desktop. So what we see is that mobile visitors, when they have a low-quality visit, are far more likely to have a bounce-back behavior. So they're very likely to open the page and basically immediately abandon it. On the other hand, desktop visitors are much more likely to have idle as their kind of low-quality engagement pattern. And so what that tells us is that when it comes to kind of building a quality engagement with a reader, those first few seconds are critical. That means that, first of all, our page actually has to load. If our page doesn't even load in those first few seconds, you're not going to get that reader to engage. And second of all, the top of the page, the first couple sentences, the first image, and so on, are critically important if you're going to get a reader to kind of not be a bounce back, but really start to engage. Whereas on desktop, there's really just this kind of idle pattern as the main way of having a low-quality engagement with a page. Now, turning to the 3 kind of high-quality segments, we see a pretty different conclusion. So with scanners, readers, and long readers, we see a few small differences, but by and large, as you can see, these bars are basically the same length. And what that tells us is that basically the same number of people are readers on mobile and desktop, and the same number of people are long readers on mobile and desktop, and so on. Now, I think the conclusion of that, although maybe it sounds like a negative result, is actually pretty interesting and sort of heartening, right? Because one fear we might have in a mobile-first world is that a mobile visitor would be more distracted, less likely to engage, and so on. But we actually see that once somebody has engaged, they're just as likely to be a real, quality reader or long reader on mobile as they are on desktop. So that's really great and heartening to see. Now, a question you might ask about this data is, how much is this kind of based on the article versus the reader? So if somebody is a bounce back today, are they going to be a bounce back tomorrow? Or is this really dependent on getting the right story in front of them the next time they come? So we tried to look at that. Now, this slide is probably the most technical slide in the presentation, so I'll take a couple minutes just to walk through and explain what this data means. So what we're looking at here, on the left, so the rows are telling us what somebody did the last time they visited our site. So were they a bounce back? That's the top row. Were they idle? Were they a shallow visitor? And so on. So what did they do on their last visit? And then the columns tell us what they did this visit, right? So the top left is saying a person who was a bounce back and then bounced back on this visit as well. And then the saturation of the squares is telling us how many people fall into that bucket. So for example, 38% of people, that sort of dark blue in the top left, 38% of people who bounced back last time also were bounce backs on this visit. So I'm going to highlight a few things in this graph that I think are particularly interesting. The first thing that I'll note is that the diagonal of this graph is bright. So the diagonal is people who exhibited the same behavior on both visits. And so what that tells us is that if I take a visitor and they fall into any one of these buckets, the most likely thing for them to do the next time they visit is to have the same behavior. If they were a scanner, they're probably going to scan. If they were a reader, they're probably going to read on their next visit, and so on. The next thing that I'll highlight is that the bottom right of this graph, and particularly the bottom 4 squares, are particularly dark, right? And so what that tells us is that readers and long readers are particularly likely to be readers and long readers again. So readers are 54% likely to be a reader or a long reader on their next visit, and long readers are 59% likely to be a reader or a long reader on their visit. So that's a pretty dramatic difference from the other groups. And it tells us that there's this interesting segment of people who sort of have reliable reading behaviors. And we may want to think about that as kind of a distinct group, right? We want to get people in, we want them to read a story, but we also want to have them build habits of actually reading our stories over time. And that's a pretty interesting thing to think about building. Finally, in the top right, what we see is that the lowest quality visitors have kind of the opposite pattern. Right? So we see that bounce backs are only 29% likely to be readers or long readers on their next visit. Idle visitors are only 37% likely to be readers or long readers. So if you compare those to the 54 or 59% we saw earlier, we see that somebody exhibiting a low quality reading behavior is much, much less likely to become a high quality visitor on their next visit. So fascinating to see. So no talk on engagement would be complete if we didn't talk about visitor loyalty. So I want to talk about kind of habit building and loyalty for the last couple of slides of this presentation. So on this slide, we're looking at the number of visits per week of a visitor who came via different channels, and this is specifically on mobile. And we see some pretty remarkable conclusions. So at the very top, what we see is that visitors who use our app and open it directly, so actually choose to open our app, are far and away the most loyal visitors to our site. They come 9.2 times a week once they come. That's pretty remarkable. Okay? The second highest quality form of visitor is somebody who still has our app, but they get in via deep link or push, so kind of a side door traffic to the app. Those people are still incredibly loyal, but 6.6 visits a week, but dramatically lower than the 9.2 of a direct app visitor. Then and only then do we have direct visitors on the web. So they have 6.1 visits a week, what would have seemed like an astronomical number if we hadn't seen kind of the app numbers at the top. And then we have essentially everybody else. So somewhere between about 1.5 and 2, we have Facebook, we have Google Search, we have Chrome Suggestions, we have Twitter, and we have most other platforms who we've talked about so far. So we see that there's a huge gulf between platform-referred traffic and direct traffic. And we also see that there's another huge gulf between direct traffic and direct traffic in our app, as by far the most loyal audience that we can reach. And finally, to contrast these numbers with their counterparts on desktop, obviously not all of these platforms have a desktop counterpart, but to contrast the ones that we do, what we see is that if we take direct, for example, we see 6.1 visits per week for a mobile web direct visitor, and only 5.4 for a desktop visitor. And actually, if you compare the numbers across the board, we see that the mobile numbers are overwhelmingly higher in every single case. This was fascinating. As I was putting together this presentation, this was actually the only data point that sort of took me back. I had to double check it, triple check it, and madly Slack people on our team to let them know. It's totally fascinating to me because I think the intuition we would have is that a mobile reader is probably less loyal, more distracted, less likely to visit our site. But once somebody actually lands on our site, they actually exhibit a higher propensity to be loyal than a desktop visitor does. And that's completely fascinating and really, really interesting to see. So that was a lot of data. I want to wrap things up with a few quick points. As we talked about at the beginning, we're rapidly reaching and continuing to be in a world where mobile is a substantial majority of our traffic. And what we've seen overall, I think, is reason, rather than reason to be scared, it's reason to be hopeful. Right? We've seen a few interesting things. Whereas a couple of years ago, if you wanted to engage with your mobile audience, social was really the only channel to do so. We've now seen a broadening of the channels that you can reach a mobile audience. We've seen that Google Search is drastically up and is by far the dominant platform. And in some ways, although Google is a platform, I think in some ways, I find that a little bit more hopeful as well. Google is the best understood, right? They've been the longest kind of news servicing platform. And so there's the best knowledge of how to work with Google and how to optimize for Google. We've also seen direct traffic really grow in the last couple of years and become one of the main sources of traffic on mobile, both direct traffic to the web and direct traffic to apps. We've also seen that the fastest growing segment of referrers is this new segment of kind of the mobile portal. right? We've seen a number of options, and there are several more options which we haven't highlighted that are also growing incredibly quickly. And these are interesting, right? All of them have this property not only of great growth, but of being kind of news-focused, right? If we think about things like Apple News or even Chrome Suggestions, they're built to surface articles that are newsy and relevant to people. And that's an interesting thing to become kind of the new traffic driver. And finally, when it came to engagement, we saw that across the board, mobile readers were equally or even more engaged and more loyal than desktop visitors. That's, I think, a notable result, and also something that's a little bit in contrast to what we would have seen a couple of years ago. So with that, I want to open things up to questions. Folks can line up. I think there are microphones across the room. And you can come up, ask questions. When you do, please give me your name, where you're from, and then we can jump into the question. It's not on. Let's see.
Oh, yeah. OK. Hi, my name is Kathy Halley. I'm the editor of JSTOR Daily, which is a small website that's published by JSTOR, which is a nonprofit database of scholarly journals and books. And my question is this. I'm wondering if you have any demographic information that's tied to the desktop and the mobile information.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, that's one which I can't answer. We typically have tried to stay away from kind of deeply personal data. In light of GDPR, I think that's ended up being a great decision. So we don't measure age, gender, income, things like that, unfortunately. So it's difficult to speak to. But it's a great question. It would be interesting to see.
Yeah, thanks. I was just curious about age, but thanks.
Yeah, definitely. I think there may be one person in line, and then we'll jump to you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sapat from U.S. Agency for Global Media. I had a question on mobile site traffic versus app traffic. You mentioned that it seems to me from your presentation that mobile app traffic itself is sort of the highest quality, just because it's very direct. I didn't see you separate out between mobile web traffic versus app traffic. Do you have any insights into the latest trends and about whether we should invest more in mobile web versus apps?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think something that's continuing to evolve. Right now, what we see is that probably the majority of app traffic is concentrated in the largest apps. But we are seeing a lot of interesting stuff happen on the app side. I mean, even if we think about this kind of new class of mobile portals that we talked about, well, those are news apps, and in some ways are a different kind of channel, but in some ways are similar to an emerging news app produced by a publisher. So I think we haven't broken them out. The majority of the traffic that we're showing is mobile web, except where we've broken it out. But I am pretty excited about mobile app, particularly for folks who are looking to build loyalty, who have subscription models and so on, as a way of really creating a really high quality and curated experience, whether they're large or small. Great question. Yeah. If you don't want to walk back, great. Great.
I work for La Repubblica in Italy. We're actually clients of Charbit. I wonder if you can break down your data per kind of content, articles and video, if you have different information about it. And the other thing, I was very surprised about the importance of homepage, because for the last years we have been told, forget about the homepage, take care of the article as a single content. And actually, Repubblica is a very particular case, because our homepage is still the biggest referral for us, and it's quite a unique case in Europe. So probably we were pursuing the right way without knowing it.
Yeah, two great questions. So to talk first about content types. There definitely are differences in engagement, based on different content types. We've done a whole different kind of deep analyses with video, and there definitely are differences in engagement. I think video, in our last research study, what we saw is that video watching was much more prevalent on desktop than mobile. I think video also has this kind of people at work property where a small segment of people just watch a lot of videos at work, and that's the main driver of news video consumption. It's quite pretty remarkable. So that's something that we've seen, but there are differences, and it would be something that'd be interesting to revisit in a 2018 world. Our last big study on it was in about 2016. On the homepage side, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this speaks to this big reversal in kind of this question of, are we beginning to be in a post-social world? 2, 3, 4 years ago, most publishers looking to grow their audience, particularly on mobile, said the main thing we need to do is focus on is social. And actually, at the time, that was right? We saw mobile growing in double digits. We saw Facebook growing in double digits. And so hitching your growth to the ties of Facebook was often a winning strategy for growth. And now, with the growth in mobile direct, it really is a substantial change. It really is a real way that people engage with sites. And I'll note that it really is growth on the mobile direct. It's not just a decrease in Facebook. It's growth in mobile direct that is to me the most interesting story in this presentation. Oh, actually, I think you were first. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm curious, what do you think about the prevalence of email-type newsletters as a referral source towards news sites? Things like The Skim, for example.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that didn't show up in this presentation because typically email newsletters show up as dark social. Often, we can disambiguate that with things like UTM codes. But as a large bucket, they end up in dark social. I think email newsletters are fantastic, right? In some ways, you can think about email being one of those things that, especially in a mobile-first world, email clients are one of the main apps that people use on mobile, and that's sort of what's the newsletter that you read right as you get out of bed every morning. Probably most folks in this room have a newsletter like that, and they're real ways of engagement. It's almost like a different version of the homepage in some ways. And they really are meaningful traffic drivers for folks who do them well. So I'm very excited about them and think they're very much worth in pursuing. Thanks.
Hi, Dan Gaines. I'm a consultant and teach at USC. As far as the reason for the switch from behavior and between mobile and desktop, would it be just speculation, or do you have any evidence that it's possible that the just general improvement in mobile, the new apps, new phones, new everything, and sort of explain it, and the fact that it used to be that it was hard to hold on to something in mobile, and connections weren't as good, and blah blah blah, while desktop is relatively easy to move around, so you're not as loyal to the particular page you're on now, or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's difficult for me to answer definitively. I think I'll highlight a couple of things. One thing that we've seen is certainly devices have improved pretty radically in the last few years. Just the quality of devices, and also the quality of wireless services has increased pretty dramatically. And I think that's part of the growth of mobile. I think also the huge push that both publishers and platforms have made in the last couple of years to kind of clean up the mobile web, make it load quickly, whether that's via an AMP page or via just kind of slimming down the tech on a page. That makes a huge difference because the mobile web of 2015 was just fundamentally much more difficult to use. And in some ways, the shift of attention that had happened for kind of other types of content hadn't yet happened for news. And just having a better user experience, I think, was a big part of it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maria. I work at the Council on Foreign Relations. I had the same question about the newsletters, actually, and now hearing you say that they show up mostly as dark social, do you at all see organizations using UTMs more so that they can track how those newsletters are performing? And also, do you find that there's any effect? You mentioned that Flipboard made the big change of sending you straight to the site as opposed to keeping you in that walled garden. Email clients do keep you in the walled garden. Is there any impact?
Oh, yeah, interesting question. So I definitely recommend that anybody who has a newsletter strategy have a UTM or other comparable strategy. It's critically important because otherwise you don't know where somebody came in from. So if you're not setting things like UTMs and then looking them up in your analytics, you absolutely should be today. When it comes to kind of the walled garden of email clients, I mean, I think it's definitely true. Typically, most every kind of newsletter provider can get statistics about reading inside of the email client, but they're very minimal, right? All you can get is an open. That's unlikely to ever change. That's kind of a technological boundary rather than a kind of implementation one. But I think typically once somebody clicks a link from a newsletter, as long as you have that UTM code, then you can see, okay, what did they do? What visit did that initiate on my site? And typically that works okay. But you really do need to make sure that your links are annotated with things like UTMs so that you can sort of do that attribution back to the newsletter. It's really important. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Mike from Science News Magazine. Have you noticed any difference in quality or volume of traffic when comparing this general pages from search versus AMP or Facebook, regular Facebook versus Instant, or like have any of those like custom build, faster loading mobile pages resulted in traffic increase or no?
Really, really good question, and something that's there's probably quite a lot to say on. On the AMP side, I actually think I have a slide. Yeah, so you happen to know that we had a hidden slide on exactly your question, so thank you for asking it. On the AMP side, what we've seen is that AMP pages have had a very substantial rise. This is just looking at the last year of traffic, so although the graph looks similar, it's only about 12 months of data. What you see is that the AMP traffic, which is in blue, has increased quite dramatically. But interestingly, non-AMP traffic is also up about 20% in the last year. So some folks have wondered whether this was specifically kind of Google promoting AMP, but overall mobile traffic has gone up as well. What we typically see is that a user on an AMP page is more engaged, at least with that page. That varies a little bit by site. If somebody has a very, very performant site that's not built using AMP, you can also see high engagement, but particularly for folks who have slower sites or more difficult to use sites, AMP can be a relatively cheap way to kind of buy fast page load and thus higher engagement.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. If you have any follow-up questions, I'll stick around here for a minute, and then I'll also be down at the Treatbeat booth for the next hour or so. So if anybody wants to come by and chat there, would love to hear your questions, or feel free to email me if you have any kind of deeper questions to follow up later. Thank you so much.